Welcome, everybody. Hi. Wow. So we have a wonderful crowd with us here this afternoon, and we have some esteemed guests online joining us for a very special program that is the Leepa Rattner Museum of Art's Focus Friday, which happens the first Friday of every month. It is usually a docent-led program where we highlight works from the permanent collection. And we have a very special presentation today that is done virtually with the artist Stephen Kenny, who we have represented with two works in our permanent collection. My name is Christine Rank-Carter. I am the executive director of the Leepa Rattner Museum of Art. And before we begin, I just want to mention that this is a bit of an unusual program for us today. Usually this is an in-person program where we talk about the artist and ask questions and answers. This time it's hybrid since Stephen, who used to live here in Florida, now lives and works out of Virginia. So with that, we are recording this on Zoom so that we do want to make sure that you all are comfortable with that before we proceed. So just let me know, nod your heads, wave your arms. We appreciate that. We're also very excited to record this program because then we will have Stephen Kenny's talk on file, and we'll be able to use it for when we do interactive labels and things like that when we show his work. Just a little bit of background before we begin. I first became aware of Stephen Kenny back in about 2015, and he'd been showing often in the Tampa Bay area when he was living in St. Petersburg. And when I became the curator of the Leepa Rattner Museum of Art, he was the first artist on my list to have an exhibition here and kind of carry forward the museum, the Leepa Rattner Museum of Art's mission of celebrating Florida artists with the next generation of important artists in our area. And Stephen was definitely making a name for himself, having moved here in 2012. So when Stephen had an exhibition that was Internal Landscapes, The Mysterious World of Stephen Kenny, which received rave reviews and was nominated for Best of Bay exhibition for creative loafing, we had the opportunity to acquire two works for our permanent collection. One is called The Carriage, which is on view in our Made in Florida galleries right now. And the other is The Arrival, which you see behind me, which is actually a very important painting for Stephen's career. And it's important for us to have in our collection as it tells the story of artists coming to Florida and from the cold, cold north and making their way here. So this program will be about 45 minutes where Stephen will share his experiences and his life and career and talk a little bit more about this painting that you see behind me. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers, which means the audience that's here presently, which we have, I don't know, what, 15 wonderful people here. And those of you who are online, you're welcome to submit questions into the chat and we'll try to get into that, or you can chime in once we're done with the program. So without further ado, welcome, Stephen Kenny.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much. It's an honor, as always, and it's great to just be involved with the Leepa Rattner Museum, period. It's such a fantastic place, and I'm honored to be part of it. So for my talk today, what I'm going to do is talk, the first half will be mostly about my past, how I got to where I am today, and especially the influences that go into what I do. And I think it's obviously important that artwork can stand alone, but I always find that it becomes so much richer if I can know a little bit about the artist and their background and their childhood and that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk a lot about that today too. kind of fill you in. And later on, when we get to my paintings, hopefully you can see those influences weaving their way through the subject matter. So if we go to the first slide.
Trying to my apologies, this seems to be it's always something. Let me stop sharing. Hi everyone. Pay no attention. Yeah, pay no attention to the elephant in the room.
I'll just keep talking a little bit. When we get to this, there we go.
Okay.
Got that?
Yes.
Just for fun, this is the oldest drawing of mine that or work of art, I guess you could call it, that I have. And the writing on there is from my mother, who notated that it was done when I was 3 years old, back in 1965. And she proudly points out that this horse has 5 legs. So I can claim to have been a surrealist from the very beginning. But if we go on to the next slide, these are the influences that I'm going to talk about and go through. And I won't read this to you because we'll go through them one by one. But those are the major things that have influenced what I do. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll start with nature and the environment. And in the next slide, you can see this is the house where I grew up in a town called Peekskill, New York, and that is in the Hudson Valley. And this was very important because right across the street, in the next slide, you can see an aerial view with my house with the red pin in it down there. But right across the street was this undeveloped wooded area where I would spend so much of my time as a kid growing up, literally on my hands and knees. I would come home filthy. But having that available to me provided an amazing education in terms of watching nature, looking at the flora and fauna, seeing it change through the seasons. And so that experience was really amazing. And I'm so lucky I had that area to explore. Little did I know, in the next slide, I was totally unaware of the fact that there was a school of painters called the Hudson River School that painted the up and down the Hudson River where I lived. This painting by Kensit is actually a scene very close to where I grew up, and right on the Hudson River. But I didn't learn about them until I went to art school later on. In the next slide, we have a selection of these natural science encyclopedias that I grew up with. And luckily, they were on a bookshelf right outside the upstairs bathroom next to my bedroom. So I would grab one of those randomly off the shelf and look at them constantly. And they were filled with these beautiful and sometimes surreal illustrations. And I pretty much got to know every one of them by heart. So this was a very early bit of exposure to not just illustration and artwork, but natural, exploration of the natural world too. So I really spent a lot of time with these. And from there, we move on to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about my schooling. I was raised Catholic. In the next slide, you can see the school that I went to in Peekskill from kindergarten through the 8th grade. And I won't say too much except to share a story that happened on the very first day in kindergarten. The nun who was teaching us, after our parents had dropped us off and left, the first thing she did was to take out a glass clear jar that she had, small, and she held it up and it had red liquid in it. And she said, this is acid, and I'm going to put a drop of this on anyone's tongue who's caught lying. So that sort of set the tone for the next 9 years. And the fact that she lied to scare us into not lying sort of gave me a healthy skepticism about religion in general. So I'm not a practicing Catholic now, but it was a great education. And as you know, the Roman Catholic Church was one of the greatest patrons of the arts through Western art, anyway, in art history. So it was a great place to start. In that school, you'll see in the next slide, we had a little library, and my favorite book was Where the Wild Things Are. And if you don't know the story, it's about Max. That's him there in his fox costume. And if you know anything about Freud and Carl Jung, it's sort of their work in a nutshell. Max, you never see him out of this fox costume, so he's half animal and half human through the whole thing, which again reoccurs in my work very much. And it's all about his journey to this island where he tames these monsters and returns home, and everything is hunky-dory. But it's a fantastic book, and not that I just love the story, but the illustrations too themselves had a big influence on me. In the next slide, we have my first encounter with fame. There was a poster contest in the town where I grew up in Peekskill. And I was probably in second or third grade, I think, when I entered, and I won in my age range. So that kind of started off there we go. That's me on the left. Started off my notoriety, I guess, as an artist, and sort of kindled a hunger for more of that. And you can see my little poster that I designed there, which all had to do with the danger of playing with matches, but I've got my mythical dragon there. So moving along to the next, we've got perception, illusion, and reality, which has always fascinated me too. Before I could read, my parents had a subscription to Highlights magazine, and in the next slide you can see an example of what was in each issue. And they always had, so I wasn't able to read it, but they had these hidden picture puzzles, and I just absolutely loved those. And it kindled this fascination in me of the idea of artwork being more than it first appears. And in the next slide, you can see all of the hidden imagery that's in there. So I guess this is also something I try to do with each of my paintings, is sort of imbue them with the idea that the longer you look at the painting, the more you're going to see. In the next slide, there is a book that I actually still have, and follows along the same lines in a way. It was full of illustrations of optical illusions. And I would just stare at those and look at them constantly. And again, the style of illustration in these was, I really resonated with it. And you'll see that staircase, that endless staircase on the right, reoccur in the next slide, which is one of the lithographs by M.C. Escher. When I came across his work, it just blew my mind, because it took it one step further. All of his work is so realistically rendered, but they are scenes of impossibilities. So again, that really resonated with me, and his work had a huge influence on my own from an early age. In the next slide, we move on to the music that I became aware of in high school, mostly. And if you're not aware of what progressive rock is, in the next slide, you can see a group of the album covers of a lot of the groups that were involved in that. And progressive rock is typically very intricate, and a lot of it incorporates classical elements. The lyrics very often are pretty much incomprehensible, which I liked. And a lot of the music too is not broken up into 3 minute songs. The songs tend to be a lot longer, and in a lot of cases, or some cases, the album is one long song. So back then, before digital music, you would have to get up and actually flip the album over. That was the only break in the music, and I absolutely loved that, and would listen to the music and stare at the artwork on these album covers. They definitely went together. In the next slide, this was my high school yearbook. I was asked to illustrate the cover. And again, you can see the influence of those album covers here. As far as I knew, the representative from the yearbook company said that this had never been done before, so it was kind of neat to be the first to do this to illustrate the cover of a yearbook. So that was an honor. In the next slide, we move on to art history and surrealism. And as I mentioned, growing up, I had very little exposure to art or art history. I had literally been to 2 art museums before getting to art school. And when I got there, in the next slide, you can see just a brief example of the aspects of art history that I was exposed to when I got there, and it just completely blew my mind. These are just a few of the sorry, this slide wasn't actually finished before I wanted to do more to it. But anyway, you can see a variety of all the different genres and periods of art history that I was suddenly became aware of once I got to school. And I went to the Rhode Island School of Design. And of all of those styles, the one that stuck with me the most was you see down in the right-hand corner, Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory. And the idea of surrealism just really resonated with me. And in the next slide, we have a definition of surrealism by Max Ernst, who is a surrealist artist. And he said, surrealism is a linking of 2 realities that by all appearances have nothing to link them in a setting that by all appearances does not fit them. And that's pretty good. I think that sums it up pretty well. While I was at RISD, I had plans to go into the major in graphic design, but early on, one of my professors talked me into switching to illustration, which seemed daring, which I did. But by the 3rd year, I was pretty unsatisfied with the illustration department. It just wasn't challenging enough for me. So luckily, RISD had a European honors program where 30 students would go and spend the year studying independently in Rome. And if you go to the next slide, I applied and was accepted to that program. And again, I had never been to Europe, I'd never been outside the country. So going to live in Rome for a year was another mind blower, to be surrounded by all of that incredible architecture and art. And it was an amazing experience. It really changed me forever. The next slide is just the only surviving photo of me there that I know of. So the year ended, came back home, graduated, And while I was there in Rome, I realized what I wanted to do was be a painter, not an illustrator. And in the next slide, you can see one example of a total of, there were 9 of these. They were all about the same size. And so I went into a loft with 2 friends of mine from school in New York City, in Soho, actually, and went around to the galleries that were there in Soho, trying to find a gallery to represent me, and had very good responses from the galleries, but none offered representation. So I fell back on what I had learned about illustration at RISD and started putting together an illustration portfolio to try to get some illustration work for myself. And in the next slide, you can see an example of the sort of work I was doing. And excuse me. Keep in mind, this was 1993. This was well before Photoshop was even invented. So if a client wanted an image like this, they had to hire someone to paint it, or possibly do it in the dark, in a dark room photographically. So there was a big need among illustrators who could work surrealistically. And in the next slide, you can see one of the clients I eventually started doing work for was Celestial Seasonings. And that's exactly the sort of images they needed for their tea boxes. And they were great to work with. The one on the right, that box on the right, is still on the shelves. You can still find them. The other ones have been phased out, but I think overall they did about 9 Celestial tea boxes for them during my career. In the next slide, another portfolio sample. And I specifically chose Dali because there was a great need for imagery in advertising and book publishing that sort of mimicked his style. So by doing this sample, I was able to get a series of other Dali related jobs. You can see in the next slide a poster for Microsoft with a lot of familiar Dali elements, the crutch in the background, the flaming television. He very often would paint elements on fire. So they just left it up to me basically to sort of compose this image for them. In the next slide, a couple other magazine illustrations, again incorporating Dali-esque imagery. So these were great fun. And very little input from the art directors or creative directors. They would give me a general direction, but leave a lot of the composition up to me. So that was a great relief. And in the next slide, this was sort of a highlight for me in my career. This was an album cover for the group Journey, if you're familiar with them. And again, they left the image pretty much up to me. There was a little input from Sony Music, but all I had to go by was the lyrics that went with the songs on the album. And to come full circle and now be illustrating a CD cover or an album cover of my own was sort of a dream come true to have that happen. So that was a great thrill. And also at this point, as I said, had been living in New York, but moved to Virginia. And in the next slide, that album cover was done in a little bit later, but again, while I was doing those illustrations, I was still painting at night and doing paintings for myself. But I moved to Virginia, and in the next slide, you can see one of the first paintings I did while I was there. and pretty similar actually to that Journey CD cover. The color is pretty much the same, and I think the feel was very similar too. So the transition from illustration to fine art was kind of seamless in a way. Another one, the next slide, you can see again a lot of similarities. So these were small paintings that I was doing for myself, selling them to private individuals, private collectors. And while I was in Virginia, I reached out to some galleries in DC and finally hooked up with one and started having exhibitions there. So finally, my fine art career got off the ground. In the next slide, you can see another example of what I was doing there, integrating nature and the human figure, which is something that finds its way in pretty much just about every painting I do. And the reason for that has to do with just my philosophy about life in general. I think we, as humans on the earth, have really lost our connection with nature. And likewise, I think we're very good at exploring our world around us, but I think we spend far too little time going internally and exploring the landscapes within ourselves. I think we don't know ourselves as well as we really should. The next slide, more of that. And I'm going to not talk a whole lot about each one of these. I think as we go through, you can see those influences that I mentioned earlier kind of weaving their way through each of these images. And so figures in landscapes, you can see again in the next slide. You'll also notice that the color palette, the range is darkening. And that happened without my really noticing it at the time. It was just as I was growing older and thinking more about the state of the world, etc., my palette just started changing by itself. In the next slide, things get even darker. Here we have this figure who seems to be a sort of military-ish character, although he's adorned himself with elements from nature. He's got that walnut shell on his helmet for a helmet. His armor is made out of birch bark. So my palette's getting darker, and I'm getting, I guess, more serious in terms of what my subject matter was. Ironically, this was painted in 1999, which was 2 years before the Twin Towers were that whole catastrophe. And in the next slide, in the background, for some reason, I put those in there. So the two towers, so you can, it was sort of a harbinger in a way, without my knowing it, of what was going to be happening. In the next slide, more of the same. You'll see a lot of portrait type paintings, again with clothing made from natural elements, headdresses made from, in this case, leaves and insects. In the next slide, we have Bird Lady. This is pretty much pulling one painting from each year as we go forward. And so a lot of sort of settings based on my environment there in Virginia. Next slide. More clothing made out of natural elements. This actually was in my first exhibition at the gallery in Washington, D.C., which luckily sold. And it's been a popular painting ever since. Very, you can also see the Dutch influence here with that. Obviously, the painting's called The Ruff, referring to what she's wearing around her neck. And you'll see a lot of Dutch influence, not just in the subject matter, but in my painting technique. Very detailed, kind of a cool palette. Next slide. Again, very dark. You'll also notice a lot of bird imagery reappearing in a lot of my paintings, and that too wasn't uh, conscious in the beginning. It was, I realized it later on, years after I'd been working. I looked back through a lot of my paintings and realized that birds and bird imagery kept reappearing over and over again. Next slide. Barren landscapes. Next slide again. Little children too keep reappearing, especially young girls. I can't tell you why, because I don't know, but that was another thing I noticed throughout my work. This one eventually sold. It took a while. A lot of people were creeped out by it, but somebody finally, like this next slide too, a lot of people are kind of put off by it. The combination of this young boy with these elderly hands. But next slide. Subject matter relating to not so much bondage, but being bound or caged. And this is where the birds often come in, because for me, they represent freedom, the imagination, and the idea of spirit. So you'll see them time and time again. Next slide. Again, the idea of the human figure blending into nature and being at home. And my figures are either at home in nature or at odds very often to some extent too. Next slide. This was a self-portrait. Again, the idea of adorning, the figure adorning himself with natural elements. In this case, he almost looks like some sort of samurai warrior, but it's also a sort of tongue-in-cheek portrayal of him as a chicken. Next slide. This one again, combining birds and the human figure. This one sort of alluding to the idea that freedom, if he were to be able to fly, it would come at a painful price. And we'll see that idea come up again in a later painting. You'll notice that one of the strings at the top is broken, so one of those hummingbirds has found its freedom. Next slide. Duality often comes in to a lot of my work. So in this one, you have that idea of ascending, but the goose that this woman is holding is also weighted by that rock that is tied around its neck. Next slide. Again, here's that idea of gaining freedom at a cost. This figure has literally, she was planted or rooted. She was this tree figure, and she's cut herself free. So that independence has come at a price. Next slide. Again, another half tree, half human figure. Next slide. So at this point, I was still living in Virginia, but I reconnected with my high school sweetheart and moved back to New York to be with her. And this was one of the paintings I did around that time, so you can see kind of what was on my mind. Um, Next slide. And also, another thing that's happening here is color starts coming back into my work. And a lot happening in this image. Um, you'll notice the title, The Beekeeper's Wife. There's been an unconscious theme that keeps reoccurring too, which is wives of subjects who are named in the titles but aren't present. And it's the wife who is depicted in the paintings. Again, I can't give you a good explanation for that, but it is a theme that keeps reoccurring. Next slide. And shortly after getting back together with my high school girlfriend, who is now my wife, we pulled up roots and moved to Florida. And as Christine mentioned in the beginning, this was one of the first paintings I did there. And I'll go back to it at the very end. I'll end on this and talk about it some more. But suffice it to say that, again, I'm reacting to my new environment there visually. And again, color, New York is a very different place, obviously, than Florida. So you can see in the next image, I'm intentionally trying to bring color back in and also experimenting with loosening up my technique and getting almost impressionistic here. And this was one of a series that I worked on and still rely on a little bit today, but it was a great experiment. In the next slide, more imagery related to freedom, gaining freedom. This little girl, it may be hard to see, but she's holding the chain that was keeping that gate closed, and she's dropped her bolt cutters and set herself free, as well as the animals that were there with her. Same in the next slide. This little girl has picked up her father's, who is the gardener, and used his shears to cut her way out of this environment that she was in. You can see the paper dolls there on the ground, so she's sort of graduated to bigger and better things. In the next slide, this is another theme that started after moving to Florida. I refer to them as my mermaid series, but I did 5 or 6 of those. Those have been popular. In the next slide, another beach scene, more birds. And there's an interesting optical illusion in this one. That beach ball in the background is the same size as those orbs and globes in the front. But just because it's in the background, our mind likes to play games and tells our brain that it should be the size that it is. But in the painting, it's actually the same size. Next slide. More beach scenes, sand castles started entering my work too. Next slide. This one was interesting because I knew I was going to do a figure that was half flamingo and half human, but it's a good example of what happens once I start a painting. I did not know when I started this that she was going to be holding the ice skates, or that the snow globe was going to be in front of her. And originally I was planning for her wings to be all pink and orange. But once I started, I realized and changed my mind, and the idea came to me to make them out of ice. So I never know really where my paintings are going to wind up and what they're going to look like in the end. So this was a good example of that happening as I worked on the paintings. In the next slide, we have another mermaid from that series, this time with a fishing theme. And in the next slide, we have another wife, or in this case, bride theme. And the fisherman referred to in the title may be on that boat in the background, but she, her dress is made out of this fishing net, which was took quite a while. I wish I had included a detail because it's layers of fishnet, one on top of the other, and I had to figure out how I was going to do that in the painting, and it worked out pretty well. In the next slide, we have another reference to my Catholic education with that halo, but this time incorporating a nature theme with it. And the next slide, not many tornadoes in Florida that I'm aware of, but the fact that we had all those hurricanes and continue to was part of the inspiration for this one. And in the next slide, we have a detail of the bottom. You can get a sense of what's happening down there. And in the next slide, another little girl. The soldier referred to in the title is there, but his body has been replaced by these trees growing up through his uniform. And another beach scene. And in the next one, next slide, we have this woman whose dress is made from these rusty chains, but she's not bound by them. And obviously she's holding that anchor pretty easily, which would be fairly heavy, but she's sort of mastered all of those. And the tiara that she's wearing is a ship's wheel, sort of indicating that she's sort of piloting her own ship, so to speak. And in the next slide, another young girl, more birds. And in the next slide, this was one of the first paintings I did after leaving Florida and moving back to Virginia, where I am now. So obviously the landscape and the animals that are predominant here are finding their way back in. And again, in the next slide, actually, in this one, what's happening, I haven't quite given up my connection with Florida and the Gulf and the landscape there. So she's even got some coral, fan coral, as a headdress too. And one of my new collectors there mentioned to me that if I ever did another mermaid painting, she would be interested in it. So the next painting is an example of that, which I did here in Virginia, but it now resides in Florida. She did actually buy it when she saw it. And so this was this year. This is a very recent painting. And what I'm doing, you can see in the next slide, which is a detail of that one, I'm experimenting what's a technique called decalcomania, which is done, in this case, by brushing on a thinned down layer of paint and blotting it with crumpled plastic sheeting, which creates the texture that you see there. So I'm having fun with that and creating texture that way, which is, it's not easy to control, but it's a fascinating way to work. So I'm playing with that a lot in my newest works. And at this point, we'll go back in the next slide to the arrival again and talk about that just a bit quickly. When I moved to Florida that first time, I got to know a gentleman named Lance Rogers, who is also, I think, has work in the permanent collection at the Leepa Rattner Museum. And at the time, he was director of a gallery space in St. Pete called Salt Creek Artworks, I think. And we met, and he offered me a show, which I jumped at immediately. And there was a large gallery up front. So I was able to fill most of the space, but not all of it. So I decided to do something special and decided to do this painting, which is to date the largest painting I've ever done. And it is, as Christine said in the beginning, sort of a self-portrait of me arriving in St. Pete in Florida from the cold northern New York region. So it's the idea of me coming, never having dreamed I would wind up in St. Pete, but so I'm totally ill prepared and not dressed for the climate. But here I am trying to find my way and having landed there in St. Pete. So it was interesting to do such a large painting and for this to be my first painting completed there in Florida. So it's got a special place in my heart, and it's a thrill and honor to have it there in the Leepa Rattner collection. So with that, I guess we're done, and we can, in the next slide, which brings it all to a close, we can I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
You're alone.
That was wonderful, Stephen. Thank you
Right.
so much.
My pleasure.
Are you okay if I stop screen sharing, or do you want to
Sure.
reference any? Okay. I'm going to stop this so we can see some of our audience here. I know we have some esteemed artists in the audience, and we welcome any questions. Hopefully you can hear directly from our audience here, and if you can't, I'm happy to repeat.
Okay.
You know, if you're in the audience online, and you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions, say hello to Stephen. Does anybody in the audience here have any questions? Sharon Bresson, our docent, or they're going to be competing for questions right now. Sharon?
Stephen, every time someone comes into my home and sees my cardinal with its crown, they are just amazed at how wonderful that painting is. Thank you.
Did you hear her? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad the painting gets that reaction. What she's referring to is a series that I do. I didn't show any here today, but they are very small paintings of birds and other animals with crowns, gilded crowns made from twigs very often. So I'm honored that you have one. Thank you.
I have to say, I have the same print in my home, and it is the first thing that I see when I get up every day, and is the last thing I see when I go to bed at night. So thank you. It's an incredible piece to be able to see on a daily basis, and it's truly inspiring.
Thanks.
It's a great series.
Thank you.
We have another question by Marilyn Collins, one of our docents. Hopefully you can hear her okay.
Hi, I mainly do kids tours, and I don't know if you remember your painting the carriage, which hangs right behind us. And the kids just love that painting. They make up stories about why there's no baby and what that pub is. And they even spotted that little black mark, which they decided portal. And that's where it all came from. So could you talk about that painting a little bit?
Sure. Well, a lot of the imagery in my paintings comes from antique black and white photographs, and that little girl with that carriage Are we talking about that painting?
Yes.
The carriage? Okay.
Yes.
That photo sparked that image and the idea for that painting. And I've always had an urge to incorporate, if possible, abstract elements into my work. And when I was talking about the using decalcomania earlier too, that's an offshoot from that. But in the carriage painting, if you've seen it, out of the carriage that the little girl has is this possibly ominous thing emerging that is completely abstract and colorful. And I wanted to give the impression that we may not know what that thing is, but she does, and loves it and cares for it and pushes it around in her carriage. And the little portal that you mentioned is one of the last things that I put in that painting, which is this little black square on the ground, which looks like this opening in the ground. And I don't know why I put that there, but it just seemed appropriate and seemed to fit in with the rest of the image. So it turned up.
I firmly believe that it's really a portal to another universe, just like in the movie Time Bandits. That certainly someone's going to pop out of that portal from another time in the universe, and that's I hope that will be your next painting. You're welcome.
Okay.
Oh, we have a guest.
Linda and Bob Dobbs are here. We have 3 paintings that Stephen did for our 3 children, 1 for each child. And they were perfect, but you didn't have any copies of those here. But that's okay. But they are wonderful. And he painted them. We said what, you know, our kid liked or whatever, something, and he did it. And it was one was the white horse that he had when I said, I want a unicorn. So he made it a unicorn because our oldest daughter always wanted unicorns. Etc. I mean, it was wonderful.
Did you hear that, Stephen?
Hi, Linda. I heard parts of it, not everything, but
she mentioned the paintings that you did for her children, and that she needed a unicorn, which you were gracious enough to do. So, which sounds amazing. I would love to see that.
But it also had a contribution from our daughter, who called sky blue pink.
As a child.
Explain that to Stephen, and he recreated it.
So the sky was sky blue pink.
Oh.
that was a challenge, but I think we pulled it off.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Stephen as well with a PH, however. I'm interested in your childhood or at some point in your early career, were you influenced by any of the mythical chimeric figures in antiquity, like satyrs and such? Talking about the unicorns that put me in mind of that.
Yeah. Mythology has always fascinated me, that's for sure. But I kind of got into that later on. Earlier, as a child or growing up, we didn't have many books in the house, especially children's books. They just were non-existent. So I had a very stunted understanding of or exposure to mythology and that sort of imagery and themes. So I came to that later on. I should say one of the things that had a huge influence on me too was in grammar school. My cousin gave me a copy of The Hobbit, so that turned me on to J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and you can probably see evidence of that in my paintings too, here and there. But and I should say too, the whole idea of symbolism. I earlier on thought that I would educate myself as far as all of the symbolism, traditional symbolism that exists out there, and I started and gave it up pretty quickly because, as you know, one symbol in one culture could mean something completely different in another culture. So I decided to give that up and just let my own symbolism emerge in my work, and which works out really well because it sort of allows everyone to approach my paintings and find their own meaning in them without having to hunt and understand what traditional symbolism might be there. So there is none. So I like working that way.
The painting of the tree lady put me in mind of an ancient statue of, I think it was Apollo chasing Daphne. And she wasn't having any of it. And he finally caught her, and at that instant, she starts turning into a tree. And he's punishing her by turning her into a tree. And you can see her hands becoming leaves at that instant.
Yeah, there's going back to Rome while I was there, there's an amazing sculpture of that by Bernini, I think in the Villa Borghese, and it's incredible because it's carved from marble, but he was able to create the delicacy of the leaves and the all of the textures in that, and so yeah, I've been aware of that for quite a while and really like that image.
We have another question in the audience, but I have a very special image I want to share. And Stephen, you'll probably remember this, and I'm going to see if I can hold this phone up to the camera. This was a painting that was in your exhibition, Internal Landscapes, and the beautiful woman who was not the model, but looks like she was the model. We wanted to hear a little, I forget the title of that piece, I'm sorry, but we were just all stunned that she was the spitting image of this painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, I'm sorry, this is very strange, but just incredible. Do you remember, what is the name of that painting?
I'm struggling to remember the title. But yeah, that was quite a thing to happen that night, because she did look exactly like the woman in the painting. She was could have modeled for it very easily.
Oh yes. And was this in the painting, is she emerging from a cocoon? I can't.
Yeah, and the ornament on her head is a cocoon too. Yeah. Shoot, I wish I could remember the title. I can't. But
well, I think she was actually the star of the evening. There was just a crowd around her, and I think she stood in front of that painting for most of the evening getting her picture taken. She loved it. And unfortunately, she was a beloved patron of the museum and on our board, and she had passed away a couple years ago, but we still remember her and celebrate her fondly especially because of this special evening, and that we could share that moment with you. So that was we'll that just say
it was special.
So we have another question from the audience, Candy.
I'm wondering if you were influenced by Magritte or Hieronymus Bosch.
Could you repeat that?
She would like to know if you were influenced by Magritte or Hieronymus Bosch at all.
Absolutely, yeah, both of those. And I had the good fortune of being in Madrid last year, or earlier this year, where the Prado has, I think, the largest collection of Bosch's work anywhere, and that was fabulous. I was just bowled over and awestruck to be able to see them in person. So yeah, he's Magritte not so much. I really like his work, but Bosch is definitely one of my heroes.
He's one of my favorites as well. Do we have any questions or comments? I see Mark Mitchell, the renowned artist of St. Petersburg, is also joining us. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Christine. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Mark. Thanks
Good
for
to
being
see
here.
you. Good to
You
see
too.
your new. Good to see your new space there.
Yeah, it's working out. I was telling Christine earlier, the original plan was to build a studio, but for now I'm working in one of the large upstairs bedrooms, which is working out fine.
Good look. Well, I just wanted to reference your. I always love hearing your backstory. As we've talked about in the past, we have a lot in common, coming from New York and kind of bridging design and illustration in our art school experiences. And then, going commercial for a while, and I was on the other side of the table, playing the role as art director or creative director. So I might be one of the guys hiring an illustrator like you to create something. So that struck a chord. I was curious about, you mentioned the freedom that you had in creating some of those illustrations along the way, which was so great to hear. It can be a pretty regimented process, but I was curious if they really gave you free rein, or you had to submit some roughs and go through rounds of approval first, and how that went for you. And I just want to throw in a second part to the question. If you're doing a commission these days as a fine artist, would you treat it, would you include, that sort of approval round as part of the process there?
Yeah. As far as the illustration part went, yeah, that there would always be, I don't think I was ever given complete freedom, without having to submit a sketch first to show what I had in mind. There was always that step. But like you said, very often the client might come to me with a pretty much an idea fully formed, and just say, here, make a painting of this, basically. So that sort of very often took a lot of the fun out of it. But for the ones that I was given a lot of freedom with, yeah, there was always that stage where I would definitely have to give them something, a pretty tight drawing of what I was planning to do, so that they could see it and okay it. Today, with commissions, I still go through that process. I'm not at the point where I can just say, you're going to get whatever I give you. Yeah, so I will, out of courtesy, come up with a pencil drawing like the old days, and present that just to make sure they're going to be happy with the composition. So
Yeah, it seems like a good safety net, so that you don't go all the way to finish and have them upset or
right.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Although, it did happen. There was a commission a couple of years ago, portrait commission, where we went through all the way up to the point where I finished the painting and presented it, and the client didn't like it. But, in those cases, and in that case too, whenever I do a commission like that, I'll stipulate that before I go on to finish the painting, I'll have to have 50% of the whole fee in my pocket, non-refundable. So when that happened, at least I had 50% paid to me. I kept the painting and was able to resell it later on after making some changes to it. So that worked out okay.
Yeah, that's a win-win, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I guess it's good to know that even artists like Stephen Kenny are not impervious to someone not liking a commission every once in a while, even though that's really unfortunate. It's really great.
Yeah, it happens.
And speaking of commissions, I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your process in working with corporate clients like Celestial Seasonings, because we were lucky enough when we had your exhibition to they were launching one of their new teas, which was lemon lavender. that came out right when your exhibition was opening. So we partnered with Celestial Seasonings to not only get a lot of that tea to serve to our visitors, and we got to borrow the original illustration from their corporate collection. And we also had a display of your working process, which was great to see, and how you kind of go through your rough sketches and get to the finished product with the little tea box. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about working with a corporate client like Celestial Seasonings?
Yeah, it varies kind of widely, but in that case, they would approach me with the flavor of the tea and give me some sort of keywords to keep in mind. And then with them, they would require me submitting 3 completely different ideas. So I would come up with those pencil sketches, 3 of them, each one dissimilar from the next, and they would either choose one or combine them into one, and then they would require me to do a color version of that too, which was fairly uncommon, but they really wanted to know what this painting was going to look like in the end. So I would go through that stage and submit the color version to them, and then finally get their okay and go ahead and do the color or the final version. But like with the Journey CD cover, they didn't require that. All they needed to see was a black and white pencil sketch, and they were confident enough that I would be able to pull off the final color version without any trouble. So it varies from client to client.
Did the band itself have any input on the or did you get to meet them as you got to work on that
They
commission?
weren't supposed to, but I got a call one day, and it was Steve Perry, the lead singer. He somehow got my phone number, and so we were talking on the sly in the background, and that was a lot of fun. And he definitely had suggestions, but I had to find a way to not act on them, because I was dealing directly with Sony Music, the art department there. So I had to sort of appease him without getting myself in trouble.
That's actually incredible. I can't imagine being stuck between Sony Music and a rock star. So that's it sounds like you did well. That negotiated well.
It worked out well. And he actually did wind up commissioning a painting for his own collection, which I did. So that was fun too. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, we're almost out of time. I just want to give, if anybody else has a last minute question, we're happy to.
I think Victoria.
Yeah, Victoria, welcome.
Thank you. I'm just looking online and discovered your sacred story cards. Can you just speak to that a little bit? They look very interesting, and I just ordered a set.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, that is a collaboration between my wife and I. She is now a retired psychologist, and she had the idea to pair my paintings with what would you call them? I don't want to say motivational comments, but they've got a painting of mine on the front, and then you turn it over, and it's a little sentence or two that is designed to go with the painting and prompt some contemplation on the part of the person holding the card. And so those have been really, really popular, and we expanded the deck last year, I think, and added a couple more paintings. So they've been really fun and really well received. And it was also the culmination of people suggesting things like that for years and years, and so we finally got around to doing it. And her being a psychologist was perfect for her to do the text on each one.
Had you ever, have you ever done a tarot card set?
Well, that was one of the suggestions that I've gotten periodically from people, and no, never done a tarot. What made these easy was that the paintings were already finished.
Mhm.
With the tarot deck, I might have to, create some new paintings to make those work properly.
You had, I mean, I could talk to you all day. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting everyone. You had posted recently one of your animal paintings. I think it was a rabbit with a crown that was used by a brewing company for a beer can label. Is that right?
Yeah, it's I guess they found me online. It was a French brasserie in France, and they have artwork on all of their full line of beers that they offer. So they liked that one and bought the rights to use that. And they also bought rights to another painting which they haven't used yet, so they're holding that for the right time, I guess. But yeah, and yeah, and I just finished another illustration for a company in Madrid. So it's great to be able to work with people outside the US, around the world.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
I think we're gonna tie things up here. I cannot thank you enough for your time. It is so great to see you again after
You
all
too.
this time. We hope that when you come down to Florida soon, you come visit us here in Tarpon Springs. I know you're in high demand when you're
I'll
in town.
definitely try.
But we thank you again, and thank you to our audience in person and online. We're just so grateful to have you here, and that the technology pretty much worked. So that was
No
great.
glitches. No glitches.
We will be posting this video on our the museum's YouTube channel, and it will be shared as soon as it's edited. So give us a couple weeks. But we wish you all happy holidays, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to launching our 2024 Focus Friday in February. So stay tuned for that. Stephen, thank you again, and happy holidays.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so
right.
much. It's been great. And thanks to everyone who tuned in too and came to the museum. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. You all take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.